We've got 2 panels left this afternoon, and our next panel is Nightmare Noises, Audio and Analogue. And we're very happy to have chairing for us the Dr. Tom Watson. I'm going to hand over to Tom and yeah, take it away.
Thank you for that introduction. I do appreciate the in front of my my title, I guess. Hello, everyone. So I really appreciate being invited to chair the first panel after lunch this afternoon. As Laura mentioned, it's panel 4, Nightmare Noises, Audio and Analogue. Sort of areas of research that I'm really interested in as well. So our first speaker in this particular panel is Louise Pitcher, an academic currently researching the monstrous, zombie myth and genre fiction. She is interested in how texts are crafted to challenge or conform to expectations and how this influences genre, narrative parallels and the relationship between text and audience. She recently published an article with Lamina Journal entitled Charlotte's Choice, representing Charlotte's marriage and agency in Pride and Prejudice adaptations, looking at, in part, Charlotte's zombification in Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, which was a novel that I was really interested in reading when it came out. And Louise is going to be presenting her paper entitled Tape Recorders, Audio Horror, and the Knowledge That Someone Is Always Listening in the Magnus Archives podcast. So our next speaker, I'm going to invite Kit to start sharing their screen. I think that's working at the moment. So Kit Bauserman is a doctoral student in American Studies at the College of William and Mary, and their research focuses on monsters, narrative and sound, then Gothic horror and podcasting, and their paper is entitled The Click, Tape Recorders and Deferred Meaning in Analog Podcast Horror. Over to you, Kit.
Thank you, Tom. If you all will bear with me staring off in odd directions, I've got the presentation on one side and then the paper on the other. But thank you all for joining me. So, tape recorders are an increasingly occurring narrative frame within horror podcasts that communicate stories to podcast listeners in nonlinear formats marked by a soundscape that calls back to the device's material dimensions. Podcasts use static audio distortion. Okay, why is this not? There we go. Podcasts use static audio distortion and glitches to generate fear and dread in listeners by grounding tape recorders as unreliable. Another sonic marker capable of producing similar reactions is what I term the click, which occurs when recordings start and stop. To explore the horrific potential of the click within analog horror, I highlight 2 manifestations: curation and stoppage, which rely on hauntings and deferrals to generate horror. I begin with a brief outline of Derrida's ontology and difference and their relationships to analog mediums before turning to the Sheridan tapes and Jar of Rebuke to tease out the contours of curation and stoppage as techniques that use the click to generate fear within horror podcast listeners. Derrida first outlined hauntology, a haunted ontology, in Spectres of Marx, a notion that each idea in utterance is indebted to a series of previous speech in texts that do not readily appear. Hauntology focuses on the language of presence and absence, which it communicates through the metaphor of ghosts, noting the ghostly as something of the invisible visible, notable by its conspicuous absence, much like a missing piece in an otherwise completed puzzle. As such, these previous ideas, which belong to a past that no longer exists, haunt the present. In this return, time collapses, and the past, present, and future become wound together in a state Mark Fisher calls time-wound, mutually haunted and indistinguishable from one another. Ontology then has a multi-temporal concern that addresses pasts that are no longer, but still persist, and futures that are not yet, that shape the present. Ontology's relationship with the analog emerges in its obsession with materiality. Writing on hauntological music and the crackle of vinyl records, Fisher says, "Crackle makes us aware we're listening to a time that is out of joint. It won't allow us to fall into the illusion of presence. The failure of presence paradoxically creates a presence that brings the material of the analog into sharp relief. It comprises an interruptive act in which the fallibility of a particular analog medium becomes exposed as the consumer longs to return to such an era, the the consumer becomes drawn into the analog medium and its degradation while remaining keenly aware of its material properties and their situatedness as temporarily distanced from the artifact, causing increased dread. Common techniques of drawing the consumer into the interruptive aesthetics. Common techniques of drawing the consumer in include the interruptive aesthetics of glitches and this paper's central concern, the click. Viewing glitches in the click as interruptive acts presents an optimal point to discuss difference. Difference is a difficult concept to define. According to both Derrida and Lein-Henriksen, it's hard to define as a concept because it is a non-concept in a non-word, perhaps more akin to a phenomenon or a signifier of a phenomenon. Difference comes from the French word différer, which means both to defer and differentiate, both concepts Derrida employs within the potential meanings difference can embody. The word sounds like the word différence, which comprises one of the meanings of difference, but the latter contains a ghostly ah that one cannot hear when it is spoken, but see when it is written. Showcasing the sensible is not always intelligible. The ghostly ah signifies an absent and unintelligible presence within speech that cannot be heard, yet haunts visual text, moving it along. This movement partially occurs through the deferral of meaning, constituting the potentially endless postponement of interpretation. Henriksen likens it to the deferrals within the Smile Dog creepypasta, which promises to inflict seizure on those who view the cursed image if they do not pass it along. However, the viewers cannot be certain if the image they encounter is the real Smile Dog. It always promises to come, but there is no guarantee it will. Returning to the glitch and click, I would like to use the glitch to showcase how the click embodies the deferrals of difference within the auditory medium of horror podcasting. Drawing on glitch theorist Rosa Menkman, media theorist Jaco Kemper describes glitches as follows. A glitch is thus a seemingly faulty deviation from routine functionality, and this deviation can be communicated both visually and orally. Such deviations, when encountered in the wild, interfere with expectations and thereby have the capacity to rip the user from immersion. A glitch potentially reminds the user that they are engaging with a technology, and this technology is fallible and opaque. The glitch in the horror podcast, communicated orderly, constitutes a narrative interruption that returns the focus to a technological object. The click does something similar and reminds the listener of the tape recorder's fallibility, but not necessarily in the sense that it can degrade and corrupt. Instead, the focus is on it as a mediative instrument. In his study of interactivity in found media horror, Jacques Mello describes how in the Magnus Archives, tape recorders sometimes click on without human intervention, recording private conversations. The click returns the focus to how those who press the button, human or not, determine the control of information and its flow by selectively providing or denying the listener narrative content. When the narrative information stops or suddenly starts, meaning and interpretation become suspended, and the listener becomes more keenly aware of the tape recorder's analog nature and subjectivity to outside forces, individuals, and events that might interrupt the narrative. Two methods by which the click draws in listeners through an uncanny awareness of its material nature and fallibility to generate dread and fear include what I term curation and stoppage. These narrative techniques can occur when a podcast employs tape recorders as a narrative frame. In curation, a party external to the narrative plays the tapes back to the listener. This party can be completely silent, hinted at, or even present as a character temporarily removed, as in the future of the narrative. What is most necessary is that they act as a mediative force between the narrative and the listener that controls the flow of information, making them a curator potentially as fallible as the medium that controls the flow of, as fallible as the medium they play back for the listeners. Stoppage, on the other hand, requires no mediator between the narrative and the listener as an external force, like a paranormal entity might cause the tape recorder to stop, or a character might turn a recorder off upon realizing they left it on. Most important is the generation of suspense, which can occur in the middle of a narrative climax or at the end of an episode, prompting the listener to click the next episode to resolve the narrative tension. I will now turn to the Sheridan Tapes and Jar of Rebuke podcast as case studies to outline the features of curation and stoppage. Following a brief description, I will use the former to explore curation and the latter stoppage. While each narrative contains both elements, Jar of Rebuke utilizes the enclosure, a known entity, to play back the tapes to the listener and is not wholly reliant on the tape recorder as a narrative frame. As such, the narrative silences within the Sheridan tapes provides a more potent avenue to theorize an unreliable curator. The Sheridan Tapes is a found audio horror series created by Van Winkle. The story focuses on Samuel Isaac Bailey, a not-so-human former homicide detective turned fugitive and independent contractor, investigating the disappearance of horror author Anna Sheridan. Sam listens to and evaluates the eponymous Sheridan Tapes, a series of recordings left behind by Anna, who had a habit of recording everything. Eventually, Sam adopts Anna's habit of recording and creates audio logs for personal and professional use. Jar of Rebuke is a horror series created by Casper Oliver. This series focuses on Dr. Jared Howe, an immortal cryptozoologist at the enclosure in Wichton, Indiana, who has no memories until 2 years before the story begins. Under the encouragement of his therapists, Jared records a series of audio logs on a tape recorder about his work, life, and relationships to jog his memory. The Sheridan Tapes begins with the click of a tape recorder. While it is not initially clear if the sound is diegetic, as the early episodes comprise recordings of Sam's responses to Anna's recordings, as more characters record audio logs independent of one another, it becomes clear that these recordings are not live and instead played back to the listener by a silent third party to construct an overall narrative. The Fire in Which We Burn is a notable example. The episode begins with a cold open presented on a cassette player of a phone call between Anna and her girlfriend Maria Soul, where Anna asks Maria to meet her in Oslo County, Nevada. Sam does not respond to this recording when his own tape recorder clicks, instead discussing a strange encounter he had in the forest while hiding from his former boss, Chief Edgar Morrison, following a standoff where Morrison tried to use Sam to capture monsters in Oslo County. Sam's lack of response showcases that these two recordings, which inhabit the same narrative container, are unrelated despite their sequential playback. Additionally, when examined from episode to episode, the story contains recordings that other characters could not be aware of, as they occur contemporaneous with other recordings but hundreds of miles apart. With a third party playing recordings to the listener, their ordering and inclusion becomes subject to scrutiny. The party clearly possesses Anna and Sam's audio logs and those by characters like Ned LaRoe, who becomes a prominent character in the series' 4th season. Anna's tapes are particularly noteworthy as the curator does not play them all for the listener, as at various points in the series, like the episode These Impending Shades, Sam notes that many of the tapes contain story drafts or ramblings which the listener does not get to hear. As such, The Fire in Which We Burn showcases a selective playback at work. The curator determines, sorry, I lost my place within this. Yes, what the listener hears. There then emerges a question of what stories the unseen curator keeps from the listener, as if they do not play all of Anna's tapes for the listener, they do not play all of Sam's tapes, as over a week passes between 2 of Sam's appearances in season 2, a time by which he has made a habit of recording every happening around him. Through the sound of the click, the curator haunts the story, ensuring the listener cannot know if the presented story is the complete story, and instead the listener must keep on, hoping for deferred information to fill in the narrative and perspective gaps. Jar of Rebuke contains numerous incidents of tape recorder stoppage used to generate suspense, fear, and dread in the listener. A notable example occurs within Aloft the Loft. I highlight this episode as it contains one of the few stoppages within an episode, as the series relies primarily on cliffhangers to encourage the listener to stay with the podcast, such as in Caught and Gone, where Jared screams after hearing a voice when trying to communicate with a disembodied presence in his home. In Aloft the Loft, Jared investigates an extraterrestrial case at his boyfriend Darius's family farm. Jared determines that if an alien is still present, it is within the barn. Jared ascends the loft to try and look for it, but the wood begins to creak, and he exclaims, pardon my language, "Shit," before a loud crash. The tape recorder whirs and clicks several times with several vibrations between them. As this occurs, the listener must sit and listen, hoping that with each click, the resolution might explain what happened to Jared. After repeating 3 times, Jared groans and reveals that he fell from the loft, hitting his head and dying. While the resolution ultimately comes, the deferral of the resolution occurs multiple times, making an experience highly reminiscent of difference, where one hopes for a resolution that is not promised. Part of the reason the resolution is deferred is that the recorder breaks from hitting the ground after falling from the loft. However, this breakage is not immediate, as it sputters and records a series of vibrations later revealed as messages to Jared's phone from Darius, wondering about Jared's whereabouts. While not speech, the sounds of the recorder and message constitute a phenomenon similar to the ghostly of difference, which requires contextualization outside of the signified event to become interpretable. Sensible sound is not always intelligible. As such, by showcasing the breaking of the tape recorder, albeit in a manner different from the traditional degradation of analog horror, the fall, click, and whirring call back to the materiality and the darkness the audio drama must navigate to become intelligible as a medium dependent entirely upon sound in a genre that traditionally privileges sight. The conclusion of Jared's fall is deferred, requiring his speech and testimony for the listeners to determine what happened to Jared is only communicated via sound effects, mimicking the difference between speech and language Derrida harkens back to in his essay on difference. Not a one-to-one comparison, the event still demonstrates difference as useful to the Analog Horror podcast, which often features failing media. While the above episodes feature a brief engagement with hauntology and difference's importance to the analog horror genre, especially context, the relevance slowly emerges after engaging with these podcasts. Each case study above represents the conspicuous awareness of the tape recorder's materiality. The Sheridan tape showcases how the tape recorder's contents remain subject to forces outside the listener's control. The curator, whose ghostly presence is of the invisible visible, haunts the podcast. Their absent presence is marked by the click of the tape recorder, and their selections of the tape evidence narratives and information denied to the listener, encouraging them to listen in hopes that the deferred information might emerge. Jar of Rebuke similarly references the potential for the breakdown of media. While it occurs outside of the traditional aging and technical corruption common to the format, the tape recorder whirs and clicks, recording a few spaced apart vibrations before breaking. This breakage constitutes a temporary but repeated deferral, which brings the fragility of the tape recorder as electronic and physical device into sharp focus, noting the limits of such a technology to endure harsh recording conditions that damage the device, the recording, and the narrative. And that's all.
That's brilliant, Kit. Thank you very much for a very fascinating paper. I've got a few questions that have kind of spring to mind, or a few observations around sort of ideas of glitch. And you mentioned Rosa Menkman's work, which I looked at years ago myself when I was doing my PhD, many years ago, actually. So I'm going to try and recall what I was interested in at that time. So that was kind of research that fell by the wayside a little bit. So what I'll do is, obviously, I'll invite you both there on the screen. That's great. For questions. If anyone has any questions, the floor is now open, as Shelley's just put in the chat. If anyone wants to kind of put in any points that they want to discuss, I can read that out, just kind of indicate that in the chat. So I suppose I'll go first while we're waiting for people to kind of type in there. So my kind of question is for you, Kit, and I do apologize if this is going to come across as more this is a comment rather than a question, because that might be the case. I don't know. But you did mention glitch in kind of Rosa Menkman's work, as a kind of Rose is a glitch artist and wrote, as you know, the glitch momentum and all that kind of stuff, and has various manifestos of how glitches work across various pieces of audiovisual art. And I was just interested in some of the terminology and the kind of semantics of what you were saying. So you kind of talking about the glitch and the click as maybe an extension of that, as this sort of interruptive act. And for me, where I'm interested in glitch is kind of, you know, glitch as a form of violence, because it is that kind of rupture or disruption to a narrative, to an image. So I was wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more about that and how it relates to the examples that you were using in your paper today.
So, yeah, I mean, it very much is a violence to the flow of the narrative. Within the glitch, I'm very much using it as a deviation from expectations and a ripping away from the immersion in the audio narrative. Because within the horror podcast, they're primarily consumed through headphones, a very close and intimate environment. So within my own experience as a listener and some things I've seen within the literature, people often get into the stories, the real world and the sound world and the stories become blurred together. So the narrative act of the click I am putting as comparable to static and audio distortions used to rupture away and kind of, again, create that separation from the narrative and the focus of, hey, we're listening to a series of audio recordings, not necessarily participating within this narrative itself. So using it, again, as a way to violently separate the listener from the narrative that they're consuming, as they tend to otherwise meld together, especially when listened through headphones. Does that answer your question at all?
No, I think that's totally, you know, I mean, it's someone who's kind of not necessarily that au fait with podcast and kind of podcast studies and things like that. I think, you know, again, you're using those terms like rupture, and it is that kind of like, I don't know, like that participation within those kinds of ways of consuming media, I guess. It's just really kind of, I mean, because when I was looking at glitch, I'm not going to make this about me because there's other questions coming in. I just think it's really interesting. It's kind of more about the audio visual image rather than, I suppose, a podcast you've kind of got. It's like there's no visual signification there, so it's kind of how that rupturing works on that level, and I think that's really interesting. So I'd be really curious and kind of following up with you at some point, because I'm trying to. The more I'm hearing about glitch in these kind of moments of rupture, the more it's kind of making me think, oh well, maybe I need to revisit some of the stuff I did previously. Again, there's probably a reason why I didn't look at it again, but I think there's some really interesting things there. So I really appreciate that response. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So I've got another question, which I think is for both speakers. So this one, I'm just going to read it out as it came in. So this is from Bronte, and she wants me to read that out. And this is for both of you. So would you both like to speak more about the tension between reality and unreality in analog media? I'm thinking of the disparity between the quote from Kirkland that Louise cited on analog media, emphasizing verisimilitude, and the quote from Kemper that Kit quoted about the glitch drawing attention to mediation. So I guess, Louise, I can bring you in first, if that's okay, and then Kit, if you'd like to respond.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I feel like I want to deep dive to really answer this question properly, but instinctively, my assumption is that verisimilitude and the mediation aren't necessarily separate from each other. They're working in tandem. You have the sense of the real created by, hey, this is being recorded by this physical object, which anchors it even if it's hypothetically, like the Magnus Archives is not actually recorded on a tape recorder. It's recorded in a very lovely studio setup that you can see if you pay for their Patreon extras, or sometimes they re-upload to YouTube. But the idea that this is being recorded on a physical tape recorder, you can hear the click. I have not thought about the click before. Thank you for your paper. I now have many ideas. To have it start, this is when the recording starts, this is when the recording ends, this is when it's being flicked on, is something that creates a sense of the real. But it's also, it's a mediation, it's a mediated real, and it's the real is because you are aware of the mediation, because it's very easy to be unaware of the mediation when it's a digital thing. I think the classic, I've seen many variants of it, but audio editing is the kind of thing where if it's done well, it's completely invisible. So I clicked on and I heard and this is when the recording starts, and I clicked off and this is when the recording ends. It's fake, but the mediation makes it seem more real than if you just heard it, because just hearing it is so anchored in the digital, which feels unreal, even if the idea of it being a physical object recording this is equally as fake. I feel like the mediation is where the verisimilitude comes from when you're talking about analog, the idea of analog things being present in digital media. But that's where my thought goes to. I'd love to hear what Kit has to say.
Sorry, it took me a second to find the unmute button. So going back to the quote I used by Kemper, it's very much, again, the idea of within an audio-only format, you have to have a narrative hook to engage and make sure that the listener will stay with your podcast, consume it, because it demands an extra level of participation. Something I have seen multiple people talk about is you both can and can't do other activities while listening to an audio drama. It requires a very specific envisioning. And with that, there is a buy into the narrative frame, the fact that you were listening to these series of recordings, wondering where they start and stop. It is obviously a suspension of disbelief and a buy into the technologies, but when those clicks, when those glitches, when that static occurs, there is the narrative interruption that pulls you back, makes you realize, hey, I'm listening to a series of tape recordings that are not necessarily real, and these events are not recorded live, they're being played back. So it's a way to both keep the listener conscious of the medium and that they are listening to a podcast, but still keep their attention engaged. It's kind of a very double play where it pulls the listener out of the narrative, but still keeps them engaged as an auditory storytelling technique. That's kind of what I've seen for the mediation, if that answers it all.
Thanks, Kit. I really appreciate that as well. I'm sure Bronte does as well. It's a bit of a strange one, trying to sort of field questions from other people. So I'm not going to speak on their behalf. I'm sure people can follow it up in the chat if they want to talk to you in further detail. So the next question I have is from our one of our hosts today, Laura, and she said that she's happy for me to read that. So this one's for Louise particularly. I wondered if Louise could talk a bit more about the idea of the trust or the real existing in the bits that we don't hear. And Laura's saying it's interesting that we're putting faith in the ephemeral or intangible. When earlier in the discussions that we were having, we were all discussing trusting physical and analog media. So I guess if you could respond to that, that'd be great.
I'm sort of hesitant because part of the analysis of fiction is always the gaps that are left by the story, and there's nothing in those gaps. You know, there isn't any faith, trust, pixie dust in the Magnus Archives, or there is, but anything that happens off screen or doesn't happen. The authors didn't write it, it didn't happen, there's nothing created there. You know, this is it's an interesting world because it is obvious, or at least it felt obvious to me specifically, not necessarily universal experience, that there were being bits left out of the story that would lead to a more faithful. I think I'm a bit too useful in stories where supernatural entities of fear have their counterparts, you know, Pandora's box, and then hope came out at the end, and that story really lacks that in a way that makes it really amazing horror. It is really beautiful, it is really well done, terrifying, because it doesn't have any counterparts to make it better, or none of the counterparts to make it better are strong enough. But I think it's really interesting that I don't even know what to say. Yes, faith feels very ephemeral. It feels very not concrete, and I think it is a really interesting thing that they anchor the real horror of supernatural monsters that is fundamentally unreal in itself in the analog, whereas anything that might counteract that feels very ephemeral. I'm just honestly not sure where to go with that. I think it's a really interesting concept. It's almost a paper in and of itself that maybe Laura should absolutely write. Maybe not on the Magnus Archives, depending on whether it's one of your shows. But it is really interesting, especially in the context of this conference, that we have the real, and the real is anchored in fear and a physical object, a series of physical objects, whereas hope and faith is anchored in nothing and therefore doesn't really succeed in this particular narrative.
That's great. Sorry, I'm just kind of I'm trying to flick through questions and trying to get them in order that they came in. So this is a question for both of you, and this is from Dylan, and he's happy for me to read this out. So do you think that compared to film and internet analog horror, that podcast analog horror creates a greater opportunity to disrupt meaning and create fear, as the audience is given less information to rely on? Does this create a different experience to glitching in audiovisual analog horror, where more information is given, or is it a case of the more information is given, the greater the fear caused by disruption? So it's quite a lengthy question there. If anyone would like to kind of jump in on that, by all means do so.
If Kit doesn't mind me jumping in, I think it's really interesting that you mention time, or sorry, let me skip back up. Length, because my instinctive response is, oh, but a horror movie is 3 hours long, and I think the Magnus Archives is in the hundreds of hours. It's got 200 episodes, and they're averaging out, I think most of them are about 20 minutes long, but there's so much more time spent, so you have more time to give sorry, you don't mention time, you mention information. But it is sort of limited in a way because, you know, visual mediums aren't silent. They have audio, they have visual, and depending on what kind of your watching experience is, it does feel like that's one of the things that really interests me about Magnus Archives, about how they tie into the limited nature of only hearing a story, to be like, we're going to be limited in everything. We're going to limit the amount of information you find out, and the ways you find it out, in a way that really does contribute to how amazingly scary it is. But sorry, let me just reread the question for a second. I think, yeah, it really does contribute to the way the Magnus Archives becomes a terrifying series, and it does disrupt meaning. I think one of the things that really intrigued me about this particular paper was documenting sort of casually fan responses, and there's a very distinct lack of discussion about how they could make this better. I think I come at it from a bit of a Star Wars, if only Anakin had made better decisions kind of thing, and plenty of other series as well, but you really don't see that in fan responses to Magnus Archives. And some of that is sympathy for the protagonist, where you understand he didn't have the choices maybe. But it's really interesting that the kind of the disconnect between the idea that things could actually be better, and of course some of that's the fact that this is horror. Fundamentally, you know, horrors are tragedies most of the time, or a lot of the time. But yes, I do think specifically the way the tape recorder is used as a conceit to limit information, specifically in an audio only format, is absolutely used to disrupt assumptions audience might make coming from other genres. And I think that's really interesting, but I don't really have much more to say on that. Kit, if you have any responses?
So with my thoughts, as much as I want to argue that there less information creates a more potent disruption. I don't think I can reasonably privilege one over the other, which might sort of be a cop-out answer. If I have to answer, I will say the audio, particularly because one of the notable things, again, about the audio drama is the listener is the director, the costume designer, the stage director. It's all happening in the listener's head. So the lack of description creates the potential for customizable terrors. The thing that is imagined is the most terrifying for every particular listener, and in some senses, visual media cuts back on that. But all the same, again, if we go back to this idea of creating the uncanny, which also acts as its own disruption, going to Freud, he linkens the uncanny to the plucking out of the eyes, to castration, and it's very much a visual symbology. And I was reading several papers while doing this on the production of the auditory uncanny, which, while I have not studied in full, I've seen decent evidence for, especially with the ideas of the production of infrasound as well, or things mimicking human voices. But I'd say there is still a very significant privileged component, but the customizability of auditory mediums leads me to privilege them just above visual mediums, since that it can be uniquely terrifying to every individual person who listens and consumes it.
Thanks, Kit. Thanks, Louise, for that. I've got another question. I'm just going to scroll down. So this is from Palav. Sorry if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. I do apologize. So I think this is for Louise particularly. Happy for me to read it out, which is great. So does the Magnus Archives, or something similar to that, which deals with the horror of being observed, implicate the audience as one of the creatures consuming the horror and suffering of the characters?
Oh, absolutely. It's not necessarily a primary focus of the horror, at least not on the scale of the major supernatural entities, but it is absolutely a factor of, I didn't really have time to elaborate on it because I really haven't researched well enough to talk on it properly, but it is very much the fear of the panopticon. It's the threat of constantly being observed is a major contributor to the fear, and the realization is there that you, the audience, are listening at the exact same time as the monsters are, and the monstrous supernatural figures are listening when the characters don't want them to be, and so are we. And it's really interesting, especially once you get to later seasons, where it's very explicit as the characters try to prevent the supernatural entities listening in, as they try to drag back some sense of privacy and control of that privacy, that, wait, we're listening in too. It's I mean, depending on your personal listening experience, you may feel that is a major part of the horror, that you are also intrinsically suffering in, contributing to the suffering of the protagonist, or whether or not you can maintain an awareness of the fact that this is fiction and there's a distance there. But it is absolutely a factor because, they do very lean very hard on the panopticon. There's a constantly, I could always be watched, and it starts out as a panopticon, I could always be being watched, something along those lines, to eventually, oh wait, every single moment they are listening.
That's great. Thank you, Louise. I don't think there's any further questions in the chat, and I'm not going to indulge myself too much more, but I think I'm just going back to some of the notes that I made earlier in the panel. And it was just when you were talking about, I mean, again, the Magnus Archives isn't an example that I'm overly familiar with, admittedly. And it is the benefit of these conferences. You do get a list of things to either go and check out, watch, or listen to, as the case may be. But when you're talking about, I think it was the character of John Sims and Jonathan Sims, is kind of like, it's almost the person, the creator in the characterization of that as well. It kind of reminded me a little bit of maybe what Daniel Danilewski was doing with House of Leaves earlier, sort of I guess in the 90s when that book was published, because you kind of had various kind of records of things being interpreted by another archivist, and then that was like there was a different interplay with the audience that was kind of going on with that, and it just kind of struck me as that, you know, now in this kind of like era of podcasts and kind of the ways in which that media is working with those types of narratives, how something like that would work really well, and it might have a lot of synergy with the kind of examples that you're talking about today. Again, that's not a question, that's me being, again, indulgent. I said I wasn't going to be indulgent, but there we go. So I don't think there's any further questions. There is this kind of an interesting discussion in the chat about the embracing of hauntology as a discourse in horror studies, and talking about found footage and analog horror, which is always nice to see as well.
Thank you very much. Thanks so much, Tom, for excellent sharing, and
That's
thanks
all right.
so much to Louise and to Kit for really interesting papers.